Today on the All About Fitness podcast, we are in for a special, and I mean this with the best love possible. We're in for a special geek session with Dr. Jeremy Loenneke. Dr. Loenneke, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you for having me on.
No, certainly. Now, before we get into the conversation about blood flow restriction, looking at your background and your experience, you grew up in Missouri, right?
Yes.
And where'd you go? You went to undergrad in Missouri, but where'd you get your PhD?
University of Oklahoma.
Okay, so you grew up in Missouri, you went to University of Oklahoma, and now you work at Ole Miss. So it's Saturday on college football season. Who do you root for?
That's a very easy one. University of Oklahoma. And that's why we had to do it this morning because we're playing Nebraska at 11 a.m.
Okay. Oh, interesting. And now, my family are Cornhuskers, going back to my grandparents grew up in Nebraska. Now, that's interesting. And I went on off this tangent a few episodes back. But what's unique about Nebraska in the world in our industry, in the world of fitness and strength and conditioning?
What's unique about you guys?
About Nebraska? No, I didn't go to Nebraska myself. But what's unique about?
It's just a classic rivalry for sure. It goes back to I think the original Big Eight. So, it kind of went away when they went to the Big Ten. But we were still playing Nebraska when I was in Oklahoma. That's when they, ended up departing. But definitely a classic rivalry. It would have been nice if they would have beat Illinois and they would have come in at 3-0. But it is what it is.
No, we're not gonna break down. You're not here to break. College football is a whole different podcast. And then what's that picture of your left shoulder? Because I love that. I love the fact that you're a professor of exercise physiology and you have that guy in your office.
That's one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time. Arnold, it goes back to pumping iron days. I think it's somebody. I have the encyclopedia of Arnold over there as well. So yeah, I think. Anybody who's interested in lifting weights has followed Arnold's advice at some point. You may not follow it anymore, but at some point you certainly did.
Well, what's interesting to me is whenever I read stuff, and like I read a lot of your research, which is why I reached out to you. Whenever I read stuff, and you look at what the science says, the science pretty much validates what the bodybuilders do already. So one of the questions I ask researchers like yourself is, which comes first? Which is that chicken and which is that egg? Is it the research that kind of leads what happens in the industry and what people do? Or is it what people are doing in the gym and you guys go, I wonder why that's working, let's study it. Which do you think is the driver?
Yeah, I think it depends on typically what science that you're in. I think in exercise science, it's probably typically observing what people are doing and saying, I wonder if there's actually something to that. And then studying that in more controlled environments and going, there's nothing to that, but there does seem to be something to this. So yeah, I often think that we follow what they do, and then we try and decide whether or not it actually does what they say it does.
Yeah, that's where you get, because you're right. When you talk about experiments, you want to have things controlled. But when you look at what bodybuilders do in the gym, that's like constant experiment. If you look at it, they're the original biohackers. But what is your area of specialty? How would you define your area of specialty?
Skeletal muscle physiology. So mostly focusing on exercise, usually alternatives to traditional high load exercise. So a large focus of what we've done here at Ole Miss and then Oklahoma is blood flow restriction.
All right, and how do you describe? And that's how I found out about you. And I did do an interview a couple months ago with Dr. Jim Stray Gunderson, who uses blood flow restriction. Have you done any work with him? Have you communicated with him at all?
Maybe some time ago, but I've never worked with him directly now.
Okay, yeah, no, he seems to be more of a practicing exercise physiologist. He's not a researcher, but he's more of a practitioner, and he applies it. Well, what got you interested in blood flow restriction? And if you could, describe what blood flow restriction is, and then how'd you kind of go down that rabbit hole?
Yeah, so blood flow restriction is essentially placing a cuff or a wrap. So kind of a modified blood pressure cuff, or even a blood pressure cuff at the top of the limb, so the arm or the leg. And essentially, you just inflate it to a pressure that partially restricts blood flow. So blood flow is always going into the limb during exercise. But when that's done and it's combined with low load exercise, so 20 or 30% of your max, the observations that we typically see are changes in muscle size and strength. So it's just exercising with partial blood flow restriction for short periods of time, right? We're not applying blood flow restriction for hours, it's for minutes. So it's very acute application. I got into blood flow restriction when I did an internship at the University of Illinois towards the end of my undergraduate. So at that time, I was starting to get more and more interested in actually doing research. And as an undergraduate, when you're reading research papers, there's a lot of times where you just don't know what's going on because there's just things that are more advanced than what you're capable of understanding at that time. So I read a paper on blood flow restriction, and I just remember being that doesn't make any sense. I must just not understand what I'm reading because it doesn't make any sense that you would restrict blood flow and good things would happen. So I was like, I just must not be understanding. So I went to Illinois, and I was interning in a lab up there doing some animal work, muscle physiology work up there. And some of the guys in the gym that I was training at, who I had known from the bodybuilding.com message board, so it's kind of a community back in the day, they were kind of messing around with this idea of blood flow restriction, just using some different knee wraps and things like that. And I was talking to them, and I remember thinking, well, maybe I was reading that correctly. So then I just started reading about it every day, and I came back to Southeast Missouri State for my master's, and I wrote a review paper with my mentor there, Dr. Fugel, just about how we might be able to use kind of elastic knee wraps to induce this stimulus. Just an idea, and that's basically what I've been doing mostly ever since.
And that's interesting. The first time I had heard about it was maybe mid 2000s, so probably about the same time.
Yeah.
Somebody I knew in the education side of things was telling me about using blood pressure cuffs to help with hypertrophy. And like you, it was like, huh? What? You're kind of like you hear that, and it seems so counterintuitive. And then when you start talking about occluding blood flow or stopping blood flow and exercise, I'm like, that seems way over the scope of what what a normal personal trainer would do. And that's where I've spent the last number of years is in educating personal trainers. So it was one of those things where I heard about, I kind of filed it away as at some point I'll kind of dig at that a little bit more, but it seems to be coming back into trend. I mean, you've published a bunch of research over the last number of years. What's been your most interesting finding? What's the thing that's really caused you to go, wow, I didn't realize that this would happen?
Several things, I would say. I think when I went into it, there's several different ways to restrict blood flow, and there was one way that was the more popular way, more traditional view, and I went into it thinking that was probably the end all be all, the only way that it should be done, and some of our early work pretty quickly suggested that probably wasn't the case. That assuming that you're applying appropriate stimulus, it really probably matters less about what particular cuff that you're using. It's more about the technique itself. It's not saying that different ones don't have good features or anything like that, but I just went into it thinking that the only way you can do it is if you use this, and I don't think that's the case. I think another one is we started getting into this idea of saying, we need to be applying the pressure relative, because the old studies, they applied the same pressure to everyone. So we did a lot of work on that, and my original thought was that would really dictate a lot of the muscle adaptation. If you apply the wrong pressure, maybe you wouldn't get the same stimulus. And there's been some caveats added to that idea now, because we've done enough work where it suggests that the pressure applied, the relative pressure, so if I apply 90% of the pressure it takes to completely cut off your blood flow versus 40%, the muscle adaptations, in other words, muscle size, muscle strength changes, those are probably going to be pretty similar, no matter the pressure. But the vascular adaptation, so changes in resting blood flow, some of these indirect markers of capillarity, they may actually require a higher pressure. So there's also some safety considerations that you have to think about with the pressure applied. But I think those are some of the bigger ones. And I think more recently, and this is, I'll just be upfront and say, quite controversial, because it's not specific to blood flow restriction. It's resistance training in general. A lot of our work on blood flow restriction and a lot of our work on low loads has started to make us wonder whether or not that change in muscle size that we see with exercise is actually contributing to changes in strength, or if there may be two different things when we're increasing. So that last one is specific to all exercise, not just blood flow restriction, but it's certainly a controversial take, I would say.
Well, and I want to stay on this for a second before I want to ask a question about that, about size versus strength. But looking at this from a safety standpoint, I think the one thing I read in 2 or 3 papers was, as long as you have a pulse, a distal, further away from the occlusion point from where the band is applied, as long as you have a pulse distal to that, then you know you have arterial blood flow. Is that correct? Is that one way to kind of measure as a gauge of using this?
Yeah, exactly. And that's how we so that's how we set the pressure, because there's two big factors that determine how high the pressure should be. It's really dictated by how wide is the cuff that you're using, and then how big is the limb. Now, you can account for both of those if you take one single measurement, where you basically take whatever cuff you're going to use, put it on whatever limb you're looking to exercise, and like you said, take the pulse distal to the cuff. So like in our lab, we put the cuff at the top of the arm, we're placing a Doppler probe at the wrist or the ankle, and we slowly inflate the cuff until we get to the lowest pressure of which there is no flow. And then we take a percentage of that. And that's how we ensure that there's always blood flow going into the limb.
Okay, and then when you said low volume, so if I occlude my upper arms and I'm going to do an upper body day, I should only do like 1 or 2 exercises, right? Like maybe a shoulder press or maybe some type of lateral raises, and not really do a full workout wearing the bands, correct, or wearing the occlusion.
Right. Yeah. And if you haven't done it at all, I would probably start with one exercise. We've certainly done it where we've had people a long time ago. We went through total workouts with under blood flow restriction, but I wouldn't recommend that if you have never done this before. I would do one exercise, and then if you can work up to it, maybe 2 exercises. But beyond that, I mean, that muscle group's mostly going to be pretty much maxed out for the day.
Yeah, and the rep range that I've seen, and again, this is just from reading. I have a weird, funky visual memory, doctor. So when I read research, I take a lot of notes, and I'll remember what I write and all that. But I remember seeing too that you have the width of the band, it matches with pressure. You have the tourniquet applied. Oh, and the rep range. So the rep range that I saw in 1 or 2 studies was 30, 15, 15, 15. So 1 set of 30 and 3 sets of 15. So that's a relatively high volume. Is that pretty consistent with what your findings have shown?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good one to use in actual practice. In research, we started with that and used that for a long time, but we just transitioned to just saying, do as many repetitions as you can for each set. So another way you can do it is just to go to failure. But I think when you're training people in real life, it probably benefits to have some sort of goal repetitions, so they know kind of what to shoot for. So I think both strategies are fine, or even doing both, I think, is useful.
Okay, and then real quick on this thread, it's relatively safe, right? I mean, again, the perception, when you start hearing blood flow occlusion, I know that's like I said originally when I heard it, I'm like, I don't know about that, and then you kind of have the same thing. But the research that I read, there were only like the number of incidents was very, very low, considering the high number of people that the different research reviews read, all the different people that experienced it. Has that been your experience as well? That's a relatively safe procedure when applied correctly?
Yeah, I think, like we said a little bit earlier, you have to consider the 2 points. One, it's only partial restriction, and two, it's very acute. So it's applied for only minutes, not for long periods of time. But yeah, and I think the one thing we always have to keep in mind is that anytime we're exercising, there's always a risk for lots of different things to happen. I think the important question, and I think that's what you're getting at, that when we exercise with blood flow restriction, are we increasing that risk? And when we look at two of the things that people are most concerned about, which is coagulation activity or blood clots and muscle damage, neither one of those seems to be an increased risk when we do it with blood flow restriction compared to that of traditional exercise. So yeah, I would say that relatively speaking, it's pretty safe compared to normal exercise.
No, and I appreciate you saying that, doctor, because a lot of people forget that, and I remind people constantly on this podcast, exercise is physical stress imposed upon the body. And you're absolutely right. Anytime you start messing with homeostasis, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. I mean, and that's the other thing. I speak, most of my guests are researchers like yourself, not most, but a good majority of them. And I always point out that researchers don't know anything. That a good researcher, and I'm not saying that you don't know anything, because obviously you do, but when you talk to somebody like yourself, you don't give definitive answers. You give answers based on your observation. And I say that because I will always warn listeners that the more definitive answer somebody in fitness gives you, the less they know. If I say do X, if I say do this and do this, you'll get this, like you see on social media, you probably don't want to listen to that person because they don't really know. Whereas somebody like yourself who studies this stuff, you're like, well, we think this is happening. So I say that, what is the prevailing hypothesis about how blood flow restriction causes muscle growth? Because again, we don't know for certain, but based on your observation, what do you think is the mechanism of muscle growth when we start including especially the inflow, the venous inflow?
Yeah, good question. Some of the ideas that have been put forth and it's probably a combination of a number of different things, but one of them is the cell swelling idea. So when we apply the cuff, we get some sort of muscle cell swelling, and it's suggested that could turn on some of these beneficial pathways. Another one that I think becomes more prominent when we talk about resistance exercise for blood flow restriction is this metabolic accumulation. And I think one of the original ideas, and I think we put a lot of stock into this early on, was that there could be something very unique about the pooling of metabolites in or around that muscle. So just in and of itself, that could be useful. So just the fact that we're bathing that muscle and these metabolites that are produced during exercise, that might be useful. I've started to pull away from that idea only because there's just not a lot of data that suggests that in and of itself is driving it. I do think that those pooling of metabolites, though, might help provide a reason for why we see such high levels of muscle activation. And so I think the metabolite effect is probably indirect in the fact that it's helping to induce fatigue, so we recruit more and more and more and more fibers. And that's where I think it becomes interesting, because the question generally is there something unique about blood flow restriction? Is the mechanism different than that of traditional high load exercise? And I think at the fiber level, I don't think that's the case. I think once the fiber is activated, and it's activated for a sufficient duration of time, similar to what we see with traditional exercise, when we look at the fiber, all of those mechanisms, at least from what I can tell, are the same things that you'd expect to see with high load exercise. So I think that the neural activation of how we recruit those fibers is quite a bit different when we're using a low load versus a high load. But once we activate the fiber itself, all those pathways, and from what I can tell, in my opinion, is very similar. But I think the initiators are cell swelling perhaps, and then this metabolic accumulation, which induces fatigue.
Well, and that's interesting because I'm thinking about, again, going back to the bodybuilding, because the bodybuilding era, which calls for a high volume. If you're following a bodybuilding protocol, you're doing a single muscle group, like say chest, and you're doing maybe 4 or 5 different exercises, from push-ups to presses to flies, whatever, and you're probably doing somewhere 3 to 5 sets per exercise So what is that? 4 times, let's say 4, 16. So you're doing 16 sets. Say you're doing 12 sets to fatigue. That's a pretty high volume, which is going to create a lot of internal pressure. So I would imagine that you would get a cell swelling reaction from that, and you're going to be bathing the tissue of metabolites if you keep that pump up for about 45, 50 minutes. Whereas with blood flow, with BFR, it seems like you're just, because you're occluding blood flow, you're increasing the pressure automatically, and then that's what's kind of triggering that response. Is that a pretty, you're just kind of, what you're doing is, instead of taking the country route, you're taking the city route, and it's more direct. There might be a little more stress on the tissue, but it's a little bit more direct. Is that kind of a way to describe it?
I think so. And yeah, I think you're right. I think you're just making low load exercise more difficult. So you're activating these fibers that aren't normally activated at that low load, because it's much more difficult, because you've reduced arterial inflow, and because you've trapped a lot of these metabolites in the limb. So yeah, I think so.
And then how about because the other thing that really that startled me, and for listeners, I'm sorry to be getting a little bit in the weeds on this, but this is, after reading your studies, I'm kind of fanboying out here, to be 100% honest about this. But one of the things that was interesting to me was you have two muscle fiber types, or two dominant fiber types. You have the oxidative, the type 1, that rely on oxygen, and then you have the type 2, which can rely on anaerobic. So one of the other mechanisms that was interesting to me, is this one of the things where if you reduce blood flow, you're going to automatically kind of activate the type 2 fibers quicker than you would if you had normal blood flow? Because from my understanding of the fiber theory, fibers will work until fatigued, and then the larger fibers, the type 2s, will be recruited to an activity. So again, does this seem like a way to shortcut, let's move the type 1s to the side and be able to focus specifically on the type 2 activation?
Yeah, I think that's generally an idea. Yeah, that you expedite fatigue to where you're recruiting those type 2 fibers a little bit quicker. I think one of the original, or some of the original thoughts too, is that you might bypass them completely and just go to type 2, but I don't think that's the case. Because there's several studies that have looked at fiber level, or at least a couple that come to mind, that show growth in both type 1 and type 2 fibers, which would indicate that they were activated. So yeah, I would agree that it does seem like you're going to be recruiting those type 2 fibers much quicker than you would without that blood flow restriction, for sure.
And is that, because I look at that, and that's, to me, is the most interesting thing, because when I talked to Dr. Jim about this, it was in the context of BFR and like older adults, that BFR can be an effective way to kind of kickstart or promote muscle growth in people over the age of 50. Would that be a way to do it? Because I think with some people of that age who don't have a history, people over the age of 50 who've been lifting weights, that's not a concern for me. But over the age of 50 who don't have a history of years of strength training, would BFR be a consideration if they're looking to gain muscle mass?
I think so. It's not to say that they couldn't get the same or similar things from just doing normal exercise, but it is an option to use, because we've done studies in older men and older women and compared traditional exercise to blood flow restriction, and I think the usefulness is that it's just another option, because some people, especially older adults, they may be unable to lift those higher loads for whatever reason. Maybe they physically can't, or they have some sort of fear of lifting very heavy weights. But the other component of that is they just may not want to. They may be unwilling to lift at those higher loads, and maybe they feel better lifting at lower loads. So it's certainly an option, and it certainly has been shown to be beneficial in older adults, for sure.
Yeah, to me, that's what the most interesting thing is. And the way I haven't started playing it with it yet. I kind of wanted to kind of go through the research and make sure I understood it. But the way I see using it is like anything else, doctor. And I want to make this clear for listeners, because I think sometimes in fitness, when a new technique or something comes out, like, for example, when kettlebell training was kind of reintroduced 15 years ago, all of a sudden everything else sucked, and the only things you ever should be doing is swinging a kettlebell. When the TRX came out, and I love the TRX, all of a sudden, forget the barbells, forget all the external, external weight. Use only your body weight with TRX. So I think sometimes in fitness we do too good of a job talking about the benefits of a particular technique or a particular strategy, So the way I see BFR working is, and I'd be interested in your feedback on this, is like anything else, is do it for like maybe a 6 to 10 week period in part of the year. If you want to work on muscle pump, say you do it between mid-April and Memorial Day to get ready for the beach, and then you would maybe maintain during the summer, and then maybe do it again at another point in the year to kind of kickstart the muscle growth process. Would that be one way to apply it? And certainly there's no right way.
Yeah, I think so. I think you could do that. You could um, use it just as a tool for whenever you feel a little bit tired or you're psychologically, I cannot lift heavy weights safely today. Maybe you do that instead. Maybe you do it when you're a little banged up to help you recover a little bit, or you could also not use it. That's also fine.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think there's a lot of different ways you can work it in, and if you're someone who's training and you're interested in training for long periods of time, let's say you're 40 years old, you're going to be training for the next 30 years. It's probably useful to switch things up every once in a while, just from a psychological perspective. Keep things fresh, keep you motivated. So this would be, I think, a useful tool for that as well.
Well, and just out of sheer self promotion here, that's exactly what I write about in my two in Ageless Intensity is, and that's but what I talk about in that, because what I realize, I'm 49 years old, and I realize I do a lot of travel on behalf of a couple companies like Nautilus and Stairmaster, and I go both around the U.S. and around the world to teach workshops for them. And what I've seen is that there's a huge population out there of people between about 45 and 65 who grew up in the 80s. That guy, that Arnold picture over your shoulder was part of their motivation. But there's this huge population out there, people between like 45 and maybe even 70, who've been exercising their whole lives. And to be honest, we don't have a lot of data on how exercise affects them long term. Has that been something in your lab that you've thought about looking at your lab, at like looking at people in their 50s and 60s who've been exercising for 30 or 40 years and kind of seeing how their muscle biopsies are different than other people who maybe haven't been exercising?
It's not of interest right now.
Okay.
And we don't do biopsies in our lab. We do whole muscle estimates. When I first got there, me and Dr. Abe had some interest in looking at kind of master level cyclists. And we did compare or look at their muscle mass and strength relative to college people. And it was pretty similar, to be honest. And their strength was pretty high. Now that's a select group of master level cyclists. I don't remember a whole lot of information on that, but I am interested, even if I'm not interested in studying it particularly in my lab, I'm interested in the idea, mostly because I'm curious if you have someone like yourself or people who are have been training their whole life, is there something different about those people than people who just for whatever reason cannot maintain exercise? That's maybe it's an academic question, but it's a question that I'm interested in. If there's something just different about those people, but I'm not interested in studying that particularly.
No, but the thing is, like, and I talk about this. I started playing club rugby, men's club rugby, when I right out of college. So I was 21, 22 years old, very, very full of myself, very arrogant, and I literally got run into the ground, doctor, by these guys almost twice my age in their late 30s and early 40s. And at my mind, at 22, looking up from the ground with like cleat marks on my back, I realized I want to grow up and be like those. I mean, that was what that's what originally did it. Was like when I get to 40, I want to be in the same fitness that these guys are now. It was kind of that like. For whatever reason, it flipped a switch. It was kind of like that monkey see, monkey do. But yeah, I just bring that up because I find it we're in an interesting, and I talk about this because we have the population of fittest older adults that we've ever had, but we really just don't know what that means. Like there's a lot that we don't know about exercise and the aging process because a number of the studies I've read over the years focus specifically on when they looked at an intervention, they focused on like a deconditioned or relatively sedentary population to do that intervention with. So I just think it's an interesting area that maybe I think I'm getting the sense I got to go do a PhD so I can start studying it.
There is interesting data in older adults where they initiate a training program, so it's not like these lifelong individuals, but I think you might be able to extrapolate to them in the sense that you're probably going to lose some muscle mass and function with age.
Yeah.
But if you are able to exercise consistently, you might be able to slow down that loss. And I think most of that slowdown of loss comes because you might get hurt less. So you might be able to stay active for longer periods of time, because there's interesting data in athletes that suggest that when they resistance train, they have a lower risk of injury. It's the same kind of thing that you see in older adults. They have a lower risk of injury. So I just wonder if there's not something to that, because there's a lot of suggestion that people do okay. It's not like this sharp decline with age. It's very slight. But what happens when they get hurt, they become inactive and they lose a lot really quickly. And they recover some of it, but not all of it, especially as you get older. So if you can prevent how many times you have those drops because you get hurt less, then that's something that I'm interested in as well, just from a thought perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it. Maybe now I'm sitting there spinning the wheels, going, maybe it is something to study, and it might be following up with you. Now I want to come back to something you talked about earlier about hypertrophy and like muscle growth, because this has been it's been going back and forth, and I've always been of the belief that you can have large muscles like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which for listeners is more fluid in the sarcoplasm of the muscle cells, versus myofibrillar hypertrophy, which is theoretically the individual fibers becoming denser. Are those really a thing, or is that just something that kind of pops up from time to time in certain literature? Is there really a difference between the sarcoplasmic, what you referred to earlier, cell swelling, and the density of fibers?
Yeah, the cell swelling, that's a very acute response. So you get a swelling effect and it goes down. Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is an idea that's been, I think, reintroduced as of late. I am not convinced that that's really that big of a thing. I think it's um, I haven't seen any evidence that really points to that. I'm open to it, but I haven't seen anything that really suggests that there's a lot of strong evidence to indicate that that occurs. It would seem like they probably occur together to some extent. Um, I mean, it's obviously going to increase if the overall fiber is increasing, but yeah, I think a lot of that comes from this idea that when you do lower loads or when you're a bodybuilder, you tend to be, relatively speaking, weaker than someone who's training heavier. So they try to come up with some explanation for that, and that might be, and to be fair, that might explain it. I don't think it does, but I don't think there's reason to pull it completely off the table.
Yeah, no,
Um,
okay. And you're right because you do have that argument about guys who train for size, guys, but people who train for size versus people who might train for strength and explosion. So, is it possible, or how is it possible that a muscle can become strong and capable of generating a lot of force, but not necessarily become large, what we would consider a large muscle?
yeah, and that's something we've been interested in for the past 5 years or so, and we've tried to address this through um, different experimental designs to try and manipulate how much muscle growth different groups have to see if that can impact how much strength they gain. So, I'll just start off early on. If you look at any book, any kind of exercise physiology textbook, the story that they always tell is when individuals get stronger, that's initially due to neural adaptations, followed by larger contributions from muscle hypertrophy. So that's something that I worked under for a long time. I assumed anytime there was muscle growth, it must be contributing to strength. Now, one of the things that really started to make me question that was, when we compare blood flow restriction to high load exercise, the growth is almost always the same. Strength is increases, but not even close to the same extent as high load exercise. And a lot of that can be dictated by how many times they're doing the strength test, etc. So that started to get us thinking that I wonder if muscle growth is actually contributing to strength, because I made a lot of excuses for it for a lot of times. But at some point, it's hard to look at your students in the face when they go, "I'm a little confused on how this might be driving this," because these things don't line up. So I had to go back and I started to think, I'm like, why do we think this in the first place? So you go back and look at the literature, and it becomes pretty clear that there's no experimental evidence that suggests that a change in size contributes to strength. So we started designing experiments to try and manipulate growth to see if that had an impact, and we could find no impact at all. So in other words, if a group increased muscle size a little bit more, they didn't see greater strength. So there's also studies that show changes in size, but no changes in strength. And again, it's important to point out that we're talking about the change in response to exercise. There's no question that people who are bigger tend to be stronger than people who are smaller at baseline. That's observed in people who are untrained and people who are trained. But the question is, when that person lifts weights and they get stronger, why is that? So, like I said early on, there's a lot of people who have criticized our studies because they're not perfect, of course, and they've criticized kind of our thinking behind that, and that's fine. But I think most of them would agree that there is no experimental evidence. There's a lot of potential reasons to believe that it might, but to me, that's never been good enough for any other topic. So why is it good enough for this? But yeah, we're doing several more studies to look at this, but it's an interesting topic for sure.
Well,
Yeah.
no, because I like that topic of the fact that I've told people for years, and this is my understanding of it. I don't go in a lab. I just read what you guys produce in the labs, and I try to extrapolate that and apply it to what we do in the gyms and then educate personal trainers on that. And I've been operating under this belief for years. And again, it's my assumption based on what I've read that if I want to work on strength, I want to work somewhere between like 4 and 8 repetitions, not necessarily to fatigue, but that last repetition should be really, really hard. And that by doing that, I'm working more on the neural activation and activating more motor units, and motor units activate the type 2 fibers. And I'm really looking at force production as opposed to volume. And so I've been looking at for years, Doc, is like 3 or 4 sets of 5 to 8 reps of the compound lifts going heavy. And that's one of the things I recommend in my books is if you want to get strong, here's how you become strong. Not necessarily big, but I've always looked at kind of separating the two. Is that? I mean, I want to, and maybe this is a little bit personal, but I've been using that because that's been my interpretation of the research. Is like, hey, don't worry about necessarily training for size, but why don't you train for strength? Because strength can enhance quality of life.
Yeah, and I think most people would agree, because if you look at the recommendations, there's 2 different sets, right? There's recommendations for if you want to get stronger. There's recommendations for hypertrophy. So I think, and to be clear, when people, and I agree, most people think that muscle growth is contributing. And the reason why they think that is because in their mind, and I think it's logical to connect that to go, well, if you're increasing muscle size, and muscle size is the contractile apparatus, so it wouldn't be that much of a leap to say that must be contributing to strength. So I'm on board. I follow the logic. I think my only concern is that there's just no evidence that a change contributes to that. So that's okay. But in my mind, I kind of fall in line with your thinking, where I think we can learn from like looking at how we program to get those things. So if we know that strength is very specific, meaning that if we want to get strong, we need to train heavier, then why don't we start looking for mechanisms that might be able to explain that specificity component? Because changes in growth certainly cannot explain the specificity component. So what might? And maybe there's changes, as you said, in the neural drive. Maybe there's changes at the muscle fiber that occur independent of changes in muscle size. I have no clue, but I do think it would be useful to say, or to investigate mechanisms that could explain one thing that everybody agrees on, that specificity is king when it comes to strength change.
Well, no, I like that, because I'm sitting here thinking as you're saying that, and I'm hearing you, because I think a lot of people make the mistake, doctor, of when they go to the gym, they're always training for size, they're always training for definition. And this kind of, what you said, have triggered something in me, but you can't always be training for the same thing. You need to go through I mean, that's where we get the concept of periodization, right? It is based on your observations, and we'll wrap it up here soon. But based on your observations about how often should we be making? Well, should we, number one, should we be making the switches from like free weights to machines to barbells, dumbbells? Should we be using different equipment on a regular basis? If the goal is just being strong and fit, I'm not training for a stage. I'm not training for a competitive season. I just want to be strong and fit. Should we be looking to change our kind of training stimulus up, and about how often? Like how frequently should we change it?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think there's any need to change anything. I see no reason why you would need to, other than the psychological component. That's the one thing that I think that would make me say you need to have some sort of manipulation, just so you can maintain, some motivation in the gym for long periods of time. Because there are some people, I have met some people who can literally do the same thing for years and make some level of progress. I can do that with the deadlift, but most other things I need some sort of a little bit of just change. Otherwise, I'm getting just bored with exercise. So I think it really just comes down to the person. I think that, as you said, if you're not training for powerlifting, so I mean, if you are a powerlifter, then you need to be spending time doing bench, squat, and deadlift. But if you're not, then what I would say, just as somebody who's trying to encourage people to do exercise, do what you enjoy. And if you start to tire of that, then make some slight alterations and then try to get better in that, and then try to get better in that. I don't have any hard, recommendation on that, other than do what you enjoy, and try to keep progressing it. But that's just my generic response, I suppose.
No, but again, that what I like about hearing that is it just kind of validates the fact that there is no real specific one way to do things, right? I would say that the argument that I make is the only thing that we know for sure is that a lack of exercise, meaning not exercising, can take years off your life, right? I mean, we've kind of seen that if you don't exercise on a regular basis, you could be shortening your lifespan. But when it comes to exercise, as long as you're not hurting yourself, you find what you enjoy and double down on that. So what are your favorite type of workouts? So somebody who studies muscle fiber physiology and does this research, do you get bored of it sometimes? You go, oh God, I've been doing this all day. The last thing I want to do is go to the gym. Or like, what type of stuff do you do for your own workouts?
If I'm being honest, yes, I do, because I'm just like every other person, or most other people who are, who you work all day and you're exhausted, and it's like, gosh, do I really need to go to the gym? But I always feel better when I do. To be honest, the thing that I enjoy more than anything is just the deadlift. So I do other general workouts as well, but my main thing that I care about and that excites me is I just try to go in and deadlift as much as I can on a weekly basis. So usually that's, twice a week. Recently it's been one time per week. I just go up and work up to a heavy single, and that's it. I follow it with a normal workout, but that's the thing that excites me is just trying to deadlift as much as possible. Outside of that, I try and stay just physically active, try to get, 10, 15,000 steps just a day, just normal activity, because I think that's, has a lot of important aspects as well. But yeah, the deadlift for me is king.
I love hearing that because I think for far too many guys, we think the bench press is king. And just to let listeners know, I do a bench press recovery group. I used to be addicted to the bench press, but after my shoulders got jacked up playing rugby, it hurts the bench. I can't put heavy loads on the bar anymore. So Monday evenings we have a 12-step program where we go through the stages of missing the bench missing the bench press. But what is it about the deadlift? I'll wrap up with this is kind of like, well, two questions. Number one, what is it about the deadlift that makes it such an effective exercise? And then I guess I didn't ask you this to begin with. Well, I want to hear your reaction to what makes a deadlift such an effective exercise.
I think the main thing is that it feels good when I do it. When I squat, I don't feel good when I do it. The deadlift is just something that I enjoy. But I do think that there is some functional aspect to just being able to because it even though it very much feels like a total body movement, and it just feels good to be able to pick something up that's off the ground and pick it up into the air. And it's one of the lifts where it's impossible to really fool yourself. So you can do a bench press and convince yourself that you can bench press 315, even though you're not really bench pressing 315. You can squat and convince yourself that you're squatting 500, even though you're only going down partially. And because to be fair, sometimes it's difficult to know, even if you're getting close, you're not getting close. But so both of those, you can really convince yourself a lot of things. There's no one who can deadlift this much off the ground and convince themselves that they lifted the weight, right? You either lifted the weight or you didn't lift the weight, and everyone can tell. So that's another thing that I like about the deadlift.
What's been your heaviest lift?
615.
Whoa.
But I kind of stumbled at the top, so I don't count that, but 610 for sure.
Well, that's okay. That's wow. I haven't even gone near that. I think 405 was my heaviest a number of years ago. But yeah, my goal is to try to do around 300 around my birthday. So that even as I get older, I got to adjust as I get into my 50s. My 40s is to deadlift 300 around my birthday. Just as kind of like to make sure I'm maintaining strength. And then final question, I kind of should have started with this rather than the football question, is what got you started interested in studying exercise in the first place? I see that picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger over your shoulder, which you were referencing, but what was it that said, okay, I want to go in the lab, I want to become a professor of exercise phys and really understand what's happening with the body? What kind of was that driver?
Yeah, so I wrestled most of my life. So I started when I was about 5 years old, and I wrestled all the way through high school. One of the things that my coaches would always tell me is like, you have great technique, but you need to get a little bit stronger. And I would always, we create this joke where I'm like, because I hated working out. I like to wrestle, but I didn't want to train. I was like, Coach, I don't need to work out. I'm too strong. I don't. So they started nicknaming me Too Strong, even though I wasn't. But then towards the end of my high school years, I guess going into my junior year, I think, my junior year, the summer before that, I started working out with one of my friends who was into bodybuilding, just kind of interested in the topic. So I was like, well, let me give this thing a try. So I started working out with him. We started reading the bodybuilding magazines. We'd go to the store, and we wouldn't pay for them quite often, but you'd read them in the store. But we started kind of following the sport, kind of getting into it, and then I started kind of getting more and more and more muscle mass. So I just kind of got to where I really liked that. Because of that, I was like, well, maybe I'll study exercise. I think that's I didn't even know that was a thing, but I want to learn more about how to do this. So that's what I did. I went to Southeast. I did my undergrad, and I thought I wanted to kind of work with athletes. That was kind of where I was, like many young people, you can't tell me anything. I knew what I wanted to do, and professors would say, keep your options open. Maybe you should consider a lot of things. And I'm like, these guys don't get me. I know what I want to do. So I did a practicum where I was shadowing somebody who turned out to be a really good friend, but he was working with athletes, and I was like, this ain't what I thought. I'm like, so then for my internship, I had started reading a lot of research in muscle physiology. So I went to Illinois and did some muscle work there, and that's where I kind of came across blood flow restriction and came back and started studying that. So that's what led me to Oklahoma, and then what ultimately brought me to Ole Miss.
Okay, well, hey, as a wrestler, being in Oklahoma must have been a special thing too. If you have a wrestling background of where you're kind of like, well, I'm at Oklahoma. You might not be on the map, but you're at least you're there. No, that's interesting, because what I found, Doc, and tell me if I'm wrong, but when you have athletes, because I've seen this in a number of my friends over the years, sometimes the best athletes hate the weight room. They would drive them. I have a good buddy who he would play pickup bat. He'd play sevens rugby or touch rugby all day long for like 5 hours until he passed out. But try to get him in the weight room for a 45-minute workout, and it's like telling him he has to remove a testicle. He doesn't want to do it. You know, I mean, it's interesting. Has that been your observation? And why do you think that is? I mean, why do you think athletes enjoy being out on the field?
Because they're not trying to be the best at lifting weights. That's
Yeah.
really what it comes down to. The old Kenny Powers quote. I'm not trying to be the best at exercise. I that was one of the things that kind of turned me off, to be honest, because in my mind I had built up this idea that training hard is. I mean, of course you got to train hard, and they when they're there they do train hard, right? But they didn't have the same level of passion for lifting weights that I thought that you needed. And that conflicted with my worldview a little bit because in my mind, I'm like, these guys, they hate this. This is going to really reflect. And then you go and watch them, and you're like, they're just world beaters and they're unstoppable. I'm like, what's going on? But yeah, that's not to say that they don't train hard. That's everyone, but it is something that I've seen a lot where it's like, I hate practice. Allen Iverson, I'm not here to talk about practice.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's just, I think that they see some benefit to it, but I think they see more benefit to actually practicing their sport and playing their sport.
And that was the opposite, Doc. Where my athletic skills were very mediocre at best. On my best day, I was a mediocre athlete, but I kicked butt in the weight room. When I was on my football team in college. When I was a member of the football team in college, I had won the top 10 GPAs. I had won the top 10 body weight to strength ratios, and I was one of the best starters on the scout team for the starting offense. So my athletic prowess did not necessarily match up what I enjoyed training. So I was on the opposite side of that scale.
Right.
Anyway, Doctor, I really appreciate your time. And what's interesting, a lot of times I have people on the podcast. They're usually here to talk about a book, or they're usually not usually, but sometimes they're here to talk about a book. Do you have a book coming out? I know if people want to cuddle up and read a good research on muscle physiology, they can do a search for your name on Google Scholar and find out what you've written. But do you have a way that people could get more information if they want to learn more about what you're doing at Ole Miss?
Yeah, they can look us up on PubMed or follow me on Twitter or Instagram at JPLOENNEKE. So at JP Loenneke. I'm not selling really anything. I do like to acknowledge though my students who are work for me currently and in the past, because you really can't do anything without really good students, and I've been really fortunate my whole time here, and still to this day I have let's see, I think 6 of them, so 6 students who are working pretty much all the time, working really hard, and they have great minds, and really good at challenging things. So that helps my thinking as well. So I think that I have to give them a lot of credit, because a lot of the ideas that we have, they come from my current students and my past students through conversations. So it's not like a one-man show, not even close. So yeah, just my students more than anything, but I'm not selling anything else.
No, that's actually great to hear. And the one thing I tell when I coach high school rugby, the one thing I tell the kids going off, the boys going off to college is get to know your professors. Spend the time, get to know your professors, because if your professors know that you care and they're serious about it, I've done adjunct faculty work, and it's like if I see a student that comes in and I can see that student is applying themselves, they're interested in the subject. Yeah, it's funny how it always, I'm not going to get you on record, but in my experience, it's funny how it always works out in the grading sheet.
Yeah, and I think that at Ole Miss we have the exercise science faculty truly does have an open door policy. So I mean, I think it's a great environment. Anybody who's looking for a school, but we go all the way up to the PhD. But yeah, I think the students that I've been able to bring into my lab have been top notch. So I'm hoping that I can keep continuing to do that, because I've been extremely lucky so far. And many of my past students are now off doing their own thing, that's always great to see as well. So
it's always cool when you see that. No, I was amazed. I went to school at the wrong time, because I went to school at college in the early 90s when Campus Rec was some weights in the corner of the gym. I was at LSU about 5 weeks ago, Doctor, and went into their main campus rec center. And the woman was like, yeah, we had to build this one to be competitive with Ole Miss. So Campus Rec seems to be run amok. I mean, if I had a gym like that when I was at college, does Ole Miss have the same thing of just like a crazy recreation workout facility?
Yeah, they have kind of two facilities. They have a brand new one, South Campus Rec. This is something my students will make fun of me for. So in our building, Turner Center, that's where our labs are located. There's a gym upstairs. That's the old one. That's the old gym. The new facility, which is a little bit on the other side of campus, is where everybody goes, or a lot of people go because it's brand new. Have a lot of stuff in there, but I've never walked through the front doors because I don't forget where I come from. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I'm training upstairs until they close that gym. So that's just my personality. They make fun of me because they're like, there are a lot of things that can make your life infinitely better that you choose not to do. But I like the Turner Center just fine.
Well, you know what? 10 pounds is 10 pounds. I mean, that doesn't matter where it is. Gravity's still about 9.81 meters a second. So no matter where you go, the weight's going to be the same. Well, Dr. Jeremy Loenneke from Mississippi, Ole Miss, I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate the insights about blood flow restriction.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.